It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to slow down, and the highway stretched endlessly into the horizon. A group of bikers, their engines roaring and laughter echoing, sped down the road. They were the kind of riders who thrived on adrenaline, always chasing the next thrill. But little did they know, that day, the excitement they were looking for would come from the most unexpected source, a scruffy, stray dog lingering near the edge of the highway. The dog was hard to miss. Its shaggy coat, once white but now matted with dirt, swayed slightly in the breeze as it sniffed around, seemingly oblivious to the speeding vehicles. To the bikers, it was an odd sight, a lone animal in a place that seemed so desolate. Curious and looking for a laugh, they decided to pull over. Their teasing started innocently enough, a whistle here, a clap there, but soon, their mockery grew louder. They barked at the dog, revved their engines to startle it, and laughed as it flinched. But the dog didn't run away. Instead, it stood there, watching them with calm, piercing eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than one might expect from a stray. There was something almost unsettling about its gaze, but the bikers shrugged it off, too caught up in their fun to notice. One of them even tossed a piece of trash in its direction, shouting, "Fetch," as if the dog was nothing more than a joke. And then, something happened. The dog moved, but not to flee. Instead, it began to walk toward the group, its movements deliberate and steady. Its eyes never wavered, locked on the bikers as if it had something to prove. The laughter started to fade as unease began to creep in. One of the riders muttered, "What's it doing?" but no one had an answer. As the dog got closer, it did something no one expected. It stopped a few feet away, looked directly at the leader of the group, and let out a bark, loud, commanding, and full of purpose. It wasn't just a sound, it was a message. The bikers froze, their laughter now replaced by stunned silence. The highway seemed to grow quieter, the hum of passing cars fading into the background as everyone's attention was fixed on the stray. What happened next was something none of them would ever forget. In that moment, the stray dog went from being an object of mockery to the center of a story so extraordinary, it would leave even the toughest biker speechless. Stay tuned to find out how this seemingly ordinary animal turned the tables on its tormentors and revealed a side of itself no one saw coming. You won't believe what this dog was capable of, and the lesson it taught those bikers that day. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances as the dog held its ground, its bark still echoing in their ears. This wasn't what they had expected. To them, it was just a bit of harmless fun, a way to break the monotony of the road. But now, standing face to face with this stray, they began to feel like something much bigger was unfolding. There was an intensity in the dog's stance, a quiet strength that seemed to command respect. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. One of the bikers, a younger man named Jason, tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. "It's just a dog," he said, taking a step forward. But his voice lacked its usual bravado, and his hand faltered as he reached for the animal. The dog didn't flinch or back away. Instead, it tilted its head, watching him closely, as if it could see straight into his thoughts. Another biker, the leader of the group, Mark, stepped in. He was older, with a gruff demeanor that matched his leather jacket. "Relax, it's not gonna bite," he said, though his eyes stayed locked on the dog. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something unsettling about the way the animal was acting. It was as though the dog knew something they didn't, as though it was waiting for the right moment to reveal a secret. The other bikers stayed back, watching the strange standoff unfold. They were used to being the ones in control, but now the tables had turned. For the first time, they felt like they were the ones being observed, judged even. The stray's calm, unwavering gaze made them feel small, almost insignificant. Jason hesitated, then crouched down, reaching into his pocket. "Maybe it's hungry," he said, pulling out a granola bar he'd been saving for the ride. He unwrapped it and held it out cautiously. The dog sniffed the air but didn't move closer. Instead, it barked again, sharp and deliberate. The sound startled Jason, and he dropped the granola bar on the ground. Mark frowned, crossing his arms. "What's the deal with this thing?" he muttered under his breath. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and the dog's behavior was starting to get under his skin. "Come on, let's just get back on the road. We've wasted enough time." But just as he turned to walk away, the dog did something none of them expected. It darted forward, not toward the bikers, but toward the side of the highway. It paused, looking back at them, its tail wagging slightly as if beckoning them to follow. "What's it doing now?" one of the bikers asked, confusion etched on his face. The group hesitated. Part of them wanted to ignore the animal and move on, but curiosity held them in place. There was something about the dog's movements, its determination, that made it impossible to turn away. Without waiting for a decision, the dog took off again, weaving through a small path that led away from the highway. It glanced back one last time, its eyes filled with urgency. Mark sighed, throwing his hands up in frustration. "Fine. Let's see what this mutt wants," he said, motioning for the others to follow. And so, one by one, the bikers trailed behind the stray, their boots crunching against the gravel. None of them knew where the dog was leading them or what they would find at the end of the path. But deep down, they could feel it. This was no ordinary dog, and this was no ordinary day. The bikers followed the dog cautiously, their bikes left parked along the shoulder of the highway. The path was narrow, winding through tall grass and patches of shrubs that seemed untouched by time. The farther they walked, the quieter it became, the hum of passing cars fading into the distance until all they could hear was the rustling of leaves and the sound of their own footsteps. The dog trotted ahead, glancing back every so often to make sure they were following. Jason, still clutching the granola bar he dropped earlier, broke the silence. "This is crazy. We're following a stray dog like it's some kind of guide. Where do you think it's taking us?" "Wherever it is, it better be worth it," Mark replied, his voice laced with skepticism. But even he couldn't deny the strange pull that kept them moving forward. There was something about the dog's demeanor, its quiet confidence, its almost human-like intelligence, that made it impossible to turn back. The group came to a clearing, and for a moment, they stopped in their tracks. In the center of the open space was a rusted, abandoned van, its tires sunk into the earth and its windows clouded with grime. The dog sat down a few feet from the van, its tail wagging slightly as it watched the bikers. "What is this?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice tinged with unease. Jason stepped closer, squinting at the van. "Looks like it's been here for years," he said, brushing a cobweb off the door handle. "But why would the dog bring us here?" Mark approached cautiously, his hand resting on the chain attached to his wallet, a habit he'd picked up whenever he felt on edge. "There's gotta be a reason," he said, his voice low. "Dogs don't just do stuff like this for no reason." The air grew thick with tension as the group circled the van. One of the bikers noticed scratches along the side of the vehicle, faint but deliberate, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way in. "Guys," Jason called out, his voice trembling slightly. "There's something in here." The bikers gathered around as Jason leaned closer to the van's window, wiping away the grime with his sleeve. Inside, he could just make out the shape of a bundle, something wrapped tightly in an old blanket. "What is that?" Mark demanded, his voice hardening. Jason hesitated. "I don't know. It could be anything." The dog let out another bark, startling them. This time, it wasn't sharp or commanding. It sounded almost urgent. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Mark sighed heavily, stepping forward. "All right, let's find out," he said, his fingers curling around the van's rusty handle. With a grunt, he pulled the door open, and a stale, musty smell wafted out. Inside, the blanket shifted. The bikers froze, their breath caught in their throats. Whatever was inside the van wasn't just an object, it was alive. Jason stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. "What did this dog lead us to?" The stray barked again, louder this time, as if urging them to act. The bikers stood there, torn between fear and curiosity, knowing that whatever lay beneath that blanket could change everything they thought they knew about this strange encounter. The air grew heavier with every second that passed. The dog's eyes never left the van, its steady gaze now sharp and intense. It was as if it knew what was inside, and it was waiting for the bikers to understand. Mark was the first to move, though his fingers trembled as he reached for the blanket. "We need to see what this is," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He was stalling, buying himself time to prepare for whatever they might uncover. Jason's heart raced as he glanced at the others. "Maybe we shouldn't open it. What if we're not supposed to know? What if it's dangerous?" His voice cracked, the tension in the air making him second-guess everything. But Mark was already lifting the edge of the blanket, his hands moving slowly, deliberately, as though the very act of uncovering whatever lay beneath could somehow unleash something terrifying. The other bikers stood behind him, their eyes wide, their nerves fraying with every passing second. The dog barked again, this time more forcefully, as if it could sense the moment drawing near. The blanket shifted as Mark pulled it back. At first, the shape beneath it was hard to make out. But then, the features began to emerge, fragile, almost human-like hands, pale and trembling, reaching out from beneath the cloth. A gasp rippled through the group as they backed away, all of them unsure of what they were looking at. What kind of creature, what kind of being, was this? Jason took a step closer, his breath hitching. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. His voice wavered between disbelief and fear. Mark swallowed hard, his face drawn tight with confusion and dread. "I don't know. But I've got a bad feeling about this." He stepped back, but his gaze never left the figure. The thing beneath the blanket shifted again, and suddenly, its eyes snapped open, dark, empty eyes that locked onto theirs with a chilling stare. The bikers froze. Time seemed to stand still as the figure slowly began to sit up, its movements jerky and unnatural. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it moved, like it was waking from a long, torturous sleep. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the world growing quieter except for the pounding of their own hearts. No one spoke, no one moved. They were all too afraid to breathe. And then, with a sudden, sharp motion, the figure lunged forward, its hands reaching toward the edge of the van. It wasn't aggressive, just fast, too fast for them to react in time. The bikers stumbled back, tripping over each other in their haste to escape the van, their eyes wide with terror. The dog, still sitting outside the van, let out a low growl. It was as if it was warning them, telling them they weren't in control anymore. For a long moment, the clearing was silent again, but the tension in the air was unbearable. The dog remained still, its gaze unblinking. The bikers stood on edge, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct told them to run, to get out of there, but they were rooted to the spot, caught in a moment they couldn't quite comprehend. The figure inside the van didn't make another move, but that was worse. Its stillness felt like an ominous promise, a warning that something far worse was yet to come. Mark took a shaky breath, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here, now." But even as he said it, he knew they couldn't leave. Not yet. Not with whatever this was still out there, still waiting. The dog barked again, sharp and urgent, but this time, it wasn't just a warning, it was a command. And in that moment, the bikers realized they had stepped into something far bigger than they had ever anticipated. Something dark and mysterious. Something that had been hidden for far too long. As they turned to face the path back, they had no idea what would happen next. Would the dog lead them further into the unknown? Would the figure inside the van reveal its true nature? The uncertainty gnawed at them, but one thing was clear, their lives had just changed forever. The bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between the still figure in the van and the dog, which remained fixed in its position, watching them with an almost knowing gaze. Mark, unable to shake the dread that had settled deep in his chest, motioned for the others to start backing away. "Let's go," he urged, his voice strained. "We don't belong here." But before any of them could move, a sudden sound broke the silence, the unmistakable crunch of gravel underfoot. They froze, every muscle tense, their senses sharpened. They weren't alone. The dog barked again, but this time it was different. There was a sharpness in its voice, something that was no longer a command, it was a warning, loud and insistent. The bikers turned in unison, eyes scanning the surroundings, trying to figure out what was coming. The trees around them seemed to rustle, but no wind was blowing. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. At first, it was just one, then two, then more. People. Strange, silent figures dressed in worn, tattered clothing. They moved with an eerie synchronicity, like they had been waiting for something, or someone. The bikers took a step back, their hearts pounding in their chests. These weren't ordinary people. Their faces were hollow, their eyes vacant, and their movements stiff, as though they were moving through some unseen force. There was no fear in them, no hesitation. They simply walked toward the van, toward the bikers. Mark's gut twisted with fear as one of the figures stepped closer, its face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing directly at the van. The bikers turned, following its gaze. Inside the van, the shape that had been still was now shifting again, and with a low, raspy growl, it slowly stood. The creature, no longer concealed beneath the blanket, revealed its full form. Its body was elongated and distorted, its limbs too long, its skin a pale, unnatural shade. But it wasn't the creature itself that made the bikers shiver with dread, it was the fact that its eyes, those same dark eyes, were now locked on them. In a flash, the figures surrounding the van moved in unison, converging toward the creature. The air was thick with tension, and the bikers felt the weight of it pressing in on them from every direction. They were surrounded. And yet, despite the terror gripping their hearts, they couldn't tear their eyes away from the scene unfolding before them. The dog, still sitting stoically in the clearing, let out another bark, this one deeper, almost mournful. It was as though the animal knew what was coming. The figures surrounding the van moved with a single, purposeful motion, as if they were trying to awaken the creature, to bring it into full awareness. Jason stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What the hell is this? What do you want from us?" One of the figures turned its hollow gaze on him, its lips parting to reveal a twisted smile. "You don't understand," the figure whispered, its voice low and rasping. "You never have." Mark felt a chill wash over him. "Understand what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But before the figure could answer, a strange light suddenly emanated from the van, casting long shadows across the clearing. It wasn't a flash, it was a slow, pulsing glow, as if the van itself was alive. The bikers, rooted in place, watched in terror as the creature inside the van began to move again, its form shifting, growing more solid with every passing second. The dog barked once more, this time, it was a full-throated, desperate sound. And then, in a moment that felt like a century, everything went still. The figures around them ceased their movements. The creature inside the van paused, its head turning slowly, as if realizing the biker's presence for the first time. Jason could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Something was happening. Something they weren't ready for. The calm before the storm. But it was too late to run. Too late to turn back. The creature's eyes locked on Mark, and for the first time, the leader of the bikers felt like he wasn't in control of the situation. The creature, with its unsettling, unnatural eyes, opened its mouth wide. And then, a voice echoed from deep within the van. Not from the creature, but from something else. Something ancient. "You've awakened us." The words hung in the air, thick with dread, as the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Mark looked around at his friends, there was no escape. The hunt had begun. The air grew heavier as the voice from the van echoed through the clearing. "You've awakened us." It was a chilling declaration, and it sent a cold shiver down Mark's spine. The figures surrounding them shifted slightly, their movements synchronized in an unsettling way. The creature inside the van had stopped moving for a moment, but now, its head tilted as if it was considering them, deciding what to do next. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt trapped, but his instinct screamed for him to act, to do something before it was too late. "We need to get out of here. Now," he shouted to the others. His voice was frantic, but there was no time to hesitate. But as the bikers began to turn, to make a desperate attempt to retreat, the dog sprang to life. It darted toward the creature in the van, its movements quick and decisive. The bikers watched in disbelief as the dog, the seemingly harmless stray, positioned itself between them and the van, its body braced as if preparing for something. The figures surrounding the van remained still, watching the dog with an almost respectful silence. Then, everything happened in an instant. The creature inside the van lunged forward, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved toward the bikers. But the dog, this unassuming, scruffy creature, stood its ground, snarling with a fierce intensity that made the figures step back, if only for a moment. It wasn't just a dog, it was the key to their survival. As the creature advanced, the dog barked sharply, and in that moment, a brilliant flash of light erupted from the van. It was blinding, like the sun itself had been trapped inside. The figures surrounding them flinched, as though the light was burning them, and they began to retreat. For the first time, the bikers felt a shift in power. The creature inside the van recoiled from the light, its form flickering, fading as though it couldn't withstand it. The dog stood tall, its eyes glowing with the same intense light that now pulsed from the van. Mark and the others watched in awe and fear as the dog seemed to grow in stature, its form now radiating an ethereal glow, the very essence of the van's power. It was no longer the stray they had mocked, it was something far older, far more powerful. The bikers stood frozen, realizing that this dog was not just a guide, it was the protector of something far darker, something they had unknowingly stumbled into. The creature from the van let out a low, guttural hiss, its eyes wild with fury, but it was no match for the dog's power. The light intensified, and with a final, agonizing howl, the creature dissolved into nothingness, its body vanishing like mist in the wind. The figures surrounding the van followed suit, their forms flickering and dissipating, one by one, until the clearing was silent. The dog, now back to its original, scruffy form, sat down in the center of the clearing, its gaze still fixed on the bikers. It had saved them, but at what cost? The air was still thick with tension, but the immediate danger had passed. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. They were in shock. Mark, his voice hoarse, finally broke the silence. What the hell just happened? Jason shook his head in disbelief. That dog, it wasn't just a dog. It was something else. Something guarding, something we were never supposed to find. As they slowly began to process what had just transpired, a final twist occurred. The ground beneath their feet trembled once more, and the van's door creaked open, though no one had touched it. But this time, the light that had once blazed so brightly was dimming, retreating back into the shadows. From within the van, a single object rolled out, an ancient, weathered book, its cover adorned with symbols none of the bikers recognized. The dog, now quiet and still, slowly turned its gaze toward the book, then back at the bikers. Its eyes seemed to say one final thing: this is just the beginning. The bikers stood motionless, the book lying in the dirt between them and the van, its contents unknown. The mystery was far from over. Whatever force had been unleashed today, it wasn't finished with them yet. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, they realized that they had only scratched the surface of a much larger story, one that would follow them wherever they went, its presence now inescapable. The dog had led them here, but it had also shown them that they were now part of something far darker and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The true journey had only just begun. The bikers stood in a tense silence, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on them. Mark stared at the book lying in the dirt, its cover worn, but the symbols etched on it still clear. Jason, who had been the most vocal about wanting to leave, was now eerily quiet, his gaze fixed on the book. It was as if something had shifted in him, something deeper than the fear or confusion they had all felt moments before. "We need to leave," Mark finally said, his voice quieter than before. "We've seen enough. This isn't something we're meant to mess with." But even as he spoke, a part of him knew that leaving wasn't going to be that simple. The dog had led them here for a reason, and there was no ignoring that. They couldn't just walk away from something so strange, so powerful, without facing the consequences. Jason turned to look at the dog, which had settled itself on the ground, still watching them with those knowing eyes. "What the hell was that thing?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the shock of everything that had unfolded. That dog, it wasn't just a dog. It was something else. The dog's gaze remained steady, but there was no answer. It was clear the dog wasn't going to explain itself, but it didn't need to. The bikers had already learned that lesson. Some things were beyond explanation, beyond understanding. They all turned their attention back to the book. Mark hesitated, then bent down, carefully picking it up. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the symbols seemed to pulse beneath his touch. It was as if the book was alive, responding to his presence. His heart skipped a beat as a strange energy surged through him. But he didn't drop it. Instead, he opened the book, and the pages, old and brittle, flicked with a life of their own. Inside, the bikers found nothing but cryptic writings and more of the same symbols. There were no instructions, no answers, just more questions. But one thing became clear: the book was part of something much bigger, a story much older than anything they could comprehend. The creature, the figures, the dog, it was all connected to a force that had been hidden, waiting, for centuries. "We have to find out what this is," Jason said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. It was as if the events of the day had changed him, given him a new purpose. This isn't just some freak accident. There's something bigger at play here. We can't ignore it. The dog stood up, as if in agreement, and began to move toward the trees, turning back to make sure the bikers were following. Without a word, they fell into step behind it, the book still in Mark's hands. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it felt as though it had only just begun. They had stumbled into something they weren't prepared for, something far beyond their understanding. But one thing was certain: the answers were out there, waiting for them. They had no choice now but to pursue them. As they walked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the path ahead. The dog led them forward, unwavering in its mission. The bikers, now more than ever, felt like they were part of something much larger than themselves. What they had witnessed today was only the surface. There were forces at work that no one could explain, and they were now entangled in it. The road ahead was uncertain, the mystery still unsolved. But they were no longer just following a stray dog, they were chasing the unknown, driven by the pull of something greater than fear. And in the silence of the evening, with the first stars beginning to appear overhead, they knew that they would never be the same again. Whatever they were meant to discover, wherever this path would lead them, it was a journey they had no choice but to continue.